Good morning. Thank you all for joining. We're just going to give everyone a couple of moments to get into the webinar. So thank you for joining us today. We're really appreciative that you're here. We recognize that many folks in the New England area are dealing with post-storm challenges, including power outages. So we hope that you all are safe and the power comes back soon. We are recording this session, so we'll make this available to all that registered, and we'll also post this to our webpage to make it publicly available. So thank you for joining, and let's get started. So I'll pass this over to Cassandra Thomas from FEMA, so she can share a bit about how FEMA's working in this space and where we're going with this webinar.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I want to welcome everyone to this joint effort by Aaas, FEMA, our various federal partners. I want to thank U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, NOAA, our local partners from the state of Connecticut, and I'm sure I've forgotten someone, Department of Transportation, and the other people have been involved in this. I'm the Federal Disaster Recovery Officer with the FEMA Region 1 COVID-19 Long-Term Recovery Task Force. And next slide, please. And we were activated to deal with the impacts revealed by the shutdown subsequent to the COVID-19 pandemic. Usually in long-term recovery, we don't come in, as this slide shows, until after 6 months to 2 years after like a typical disaster like a hurricane, to deal with big systemic vulnerabilities that have been shown in our systems, like the economy, housing, infrastructure, which we'll be talking about today. With COVID-19, the effects were so immediate and the vulnerabilities revealed on all our systems that we were activated right away. Next slide, please. We support all the 6 states and 10 tribes. In New England, we try to be locally executed, which is why we're focusing so much on the case studies toward the end of our presentation today with the city of Stonington, Connecticut. We're here at FEMA to support, as are all the agencies that are on the call today, because we believe a whole government approach is needed, and that no one agency can fix the problem of resiliency that is revealed by this pandemic, but also by our other challenges of climate change and other disasters that we're approaching. So, our goal is to be transformative and not restorative, it's becoming a cliche, but really to build back better and to build resiliency. So when things like COVID-19 happen, we're reducing that vulnerability. Next slide. So our approach is outcome-based recovery. So here today, we're talking about green infrastructure. Our goal is to get away from things that like seawalls and other infrastructure that we're finding is becoming very expensive and hard to maintain, and to move to new innovative models that is going to reduce that vulnerability I'm talking about, and improve our resiliency and just be more cost effective. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to, I think, Rebecca, to introduce our panelists who are going to be talking about these new models of green infrastructure that our Fed family, as I've been talking about, have been collaborating about in this whole government approach. So thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra. We'll just move. I just wanted to give you all a quick introduction to Aaas. So Aaas is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We have about 120,000 members around the globe. We're the publishers of the science family of peer-reviewed journals. And we have a number of programs in support of our mission for advancing science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. We're part of the Aaas Epicenter. Next slide. And our mission with Aaas as the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues is to provide clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers from the local to federal scale. So if you go to the next slide, you can see we work on a number of different issues, including green stormwater infrastructure, which is why we're here today. And so we're excited to really have the opportunity to partner with FEMA and the other federal agencies to share this information about some opportunities, efforts, and challenges that folks in New England are facing as they're exploring green stormwater and nature-based, or green infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure solutions. I'd just like to quickly take a couple of minutes to share the agenda for today and just go over a few tech notes. We've kind of divided this up into 3 sections. So our first is why green infrastructure, highlighting the scientific evidence and co-benefits. Our second session, identifying opportunities and resources for the equitable planning and implementation of nature-based solutions to address long-term economic and climate resilience. And then our third section is a chance to try and workshop what's happening for one community in Stonington, Connecticut. As you can see, we have the Q&A function there for you. So we do want to hear from you. And so please do post questions in the Q&A box, and we will we'll address these to the best of our ability and time throughout this session. So I actually see there is a question: will these slides and or video be made available afterwards? So this recording will be made available, and we'll double check on the slides, but it should all be available to registrants, folks who were able to attend today, as well as posted publicly on the Aaas Epicenter webpage. So with that, I think we're really ready to get started with the great set of speakers that we have. So the last thing I'll say is, after the webinar, we will also share with you all the bios from all the speakers, as well as a resource guide that we've been working with the different presenters and speakers to develop to help begin your exploration of green and nature-based infrastructure solutions and the resources that are out there. As we know, there are many. This is just the start for you. So with that, I think we are ready to get started with our first session, Why Green Infrastructure? Highlighting the scientific evidence and co-benefits of green infrastructure. And our first speaker that we're very fortunate to have is Brendan Shane, who's the climate director from the Trust for Public Land. So welcome, Brendan. Take it away. So Brendan, if you can, we can have you turn on your camera and unmute. We're ready for you.
All right. Sorry about that. I have to get used to where all these controls are here. Can you hear me now, Rebecca?
Yes, perfectly.
Wonderful. Hey, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with Elise for the first session and with all the other speakers today. And to kick things off with this big question and the fun part of this, I think, right? Why green and nature-based infrastructure? Well, there are many, many reasons. And I kind of wanted to start there with a focus on why we're doing this and the many, many benefits that we can all achieve for our communities, our states, and all of the organizations that are participating today. So there's a number of traditional benefits, which brought me first to working with green infrastructure when I was with the government here in the District of Columbia, the local government. And these are many of the same issues that perhaps brought many of you to this table, right? So there's water quality, water-related issues, shorelines for rivers or coastal, habitat related to that. Increasingly heat is a little bit newer. But these really just sort of are the tip of the iceberg for the benefits of green infrastructure. And so we want to, and that's, one of my main take-home messages today is to really be looking at a critical reason to adopt and expand nature-based solutions is for all of these other co-benefits. So that's air quality benefits as you green the community, and biodiversity comes as well. As you have more green space and more rich soils, there's opportunity for better and healthier food production. More people can get outside. There's physical health benefits, mental health benefits. All of those contribute to the social connection and the social resilience that's so critical to the work that FEMA and all the partners here are trying to do. To the point today around the economic sides and economic recovery, there's business and local job opportunities that are critical here. They can help right sort of inequities of the past and create opportunities for really hyper-local jobs that improve communities. And some of that is actually tied to sort of new areas of green infrastructure, organics and compost management, bioenergy from the management of urban tree canopy or other biological and green landscapes. And last, but certainly not least, is carbon, right? So I'll click over here to sort of the big picture is, I think, the magic of green infrastructure and sort of the amazing reasons to engage with community and planners and that sort of whole of government and whole of community approach that it's really exciting to hear the agencies are taking is what we need here, right? Because you can bring climate resilience, which is often where we start with green infrastructure, but those projects that are nature-based are going to bring mitigation and have an opportunity to increase the carbon capture and storage. We need to do carbon capture everywhere we can, and that includes in the green infrastructure in our communities. And then use these tools to be advancing equity, whether that is righting sort of historic wrongs and discrimination to reconnect people and green communities, or as I mentioned, to really focus on delivering sort of local job opportunities in the new green economy. So other reasons why, I'll run through quickly. You know these, I think, right? We all know that as the greenhouse gas emissions and levels are increasing, the temperatures are rising, and so we're seeing the hottest years on record. Green infrastructure is a tool that allows us to look at climate not just from a resilience side, but from a mitigation perspective. The heat that's rising globally is then touches down locally, right? So it's, as many of you know, the leading killer of weather-related killer in the United States. This map here, where you'll see, maybe a little hard to see, but a lot of New England showing up in pink here. This is actually just, these are the increases in 90+ days, sort of heat emergency days that we've seen already, right? So this is where we're living today, and great resources like Climate Central, which I'm drawing from here, allow you to also look at projections for how that will continue to increase, how it's a threat to our communities, to our families, frankly, right down to each family. Obviously, as was mentioned, I hope everyone's doing well, and you are dealing with floods, storms, and sea level rise, I guess, all right now. The last few weeks have had, some really significant impacts So I don't need to go into this impact. I think we'll talk about it a lot, and many of you are very familiar with it, whether you're inland, in the storms that devastated Vermont a number of years ago, to what's been hitting the coastlines just this week. I didn't include a slide here, but I'll just mention it too, that there is also the reverse of this that we need to look at, right? It's not the too much rain, it's the when we'll have too little rain, because this, wide and sort of wild variations, these new extremes in weather, mean that we will have the times when we'll be talking about the drought and fire in New England, even though many of the projections show wetter times coming. So the overall message is that green and nature-based infrastructure strengthens communities. So you can build climate resilience, you can improve health, you can improve equity and economic opportunity at the same time. Particularly if you take that holistic approach that was mentioned, and if we advocate and push for multiple benefits from everything we're doing. And I'll just take a second on that, because we don't have enough money or time or public will, or however you want to say, to not be getting multiple benefits for every dollar we spend on infrastructure. And so that's one of the areas that's in some ways has been difficult to quantify in the past, and we're getting better at quantifying. But if we don't get $5 and $10 worth of benefits for every dollar we spend on infrastructure, we're going to run out of money. We're not going to have enough to get it done, and we're going to be missing out on the health benefits, the community benefits that we should be getting with our infrastructure investments. So I thought I would do just a quick tour. I'm really, lucky at the Trust for Public Land. Essentially everything we do is green infrastructure. Some of it's rural, some of it's urban, and we have a whole variety of different programs. So I just thought I'd do a little bit of a tour of what green infrastructure looks like in its many forms. Starting here with Lakeview Terrace in Cleveland, right? So this is the neighborhood and housing approach. This Lakeview Terrace goes all the way back to the Roosevelts, to Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the very first public housing projects in the country. And so we have worked with them over the years to look at greening that neighborhood, both to cool it, to manage stormwater. Actually, this picture's a couple of years old, but we need more trees here. This is an ongoing process. There's also connections that are hard to see, but right behind the development here are trail connections that take you to the riverfront or out to Lake Erie. So one of the applications for green infrastructure is to look neighborhood-wide, to be thinking about how it can improve communities and housing. We spend a lot of time on schoolyards as well. There's 100,000 schoolyards in America. They cover about 2 million acres of land, much of which is, they're dispersed on purpose to be near communities and embedded within communities. So projects like the schoolyard in Philadelphia here, or the kids working on the side up in Oakland, California, are part of our process to engage with the community, to look at collaborative design, and to take what are often, too often for American schools, sort of a big parking lot of a schoolyard, and bring nature and green infrastructure into that space. And then to engage the community in the design, as I mentioned, but also in the ongoing care of that going forward and maintenance of that going forward. There's parks of all shapes and sizes. In the Trust for Public Land, we do parks of many kinds. And I should mention, at least quickly, for those of you who don't know, TPL, we do a lot of work in New England from offices in New Haven and Boston, Portland and Montpelier. And we have a great teams up there who you should meet if you haven't met them already. But here I'm focusing on two major parks. Sometimes the parks are big on purpose, right? So these are two very large park projects in Atlanta that have just been completed in the last few years. Here, stormwater management was a driver. They had a history of deadly inland, of localized flooding here in neighborhoods. And so these parks are designed to manage millions of gallons of stormwater in those extreme events, but then also to be new community gathering places, access to nature, and increasingly, as they grow up, cooler and healthier places for the community to be. We'll talk a bunch later about shorelines and natural shorelines, but I will mention here some examples. So in Newark, It's a different waterfront there, formerly industrialized, frankly, a heavily polluted waterfront. So we do waterfront projects that in this case, and many of them, are reconnecting people to, formerly kind of abandoned water features and access. Here it's bringing people together. In this case, is actually capping pollution. And then you can maybe see a little bit the rise off to the left. This also is designed to provide 500-year flood protection elevation for the ironbound community that sits behind it. And that was really devastated by Hurricane Sandy. So some of these are disaster, response and disaster preparedness programs, projects as well, when we're dealing with vulnerable waterfronts. There are then gardens and trails. There's many forms of green infrastructure, and I wanted to just sort of try to highlight some of them because they look different here, Denver or Seattle or Cleveland, right? So these are it can take many forms, and frankly, the more of it you have, the better, right? Wherever we can be sort of depaving, getting away from the impervious and the hot paved areas that we've been emphasizing too much for too long, and sort of re-greening areas, getting rid of the pavement, bringing the green and nature-based solutions back in. I think the better off we all are. And last but not least are urban canopy and just natural areas, be they large natural areas or even small ones. There's increasingly extensive evidence, right, on the benefits of people being in nature for their mental health, for their physical health, not to mention the stormwater management, the water quality benefit, watershed protection, carbon capture that you get from natural areas and from urban canopy. So unfortunately, when it comes to trees and communities, we are on a pretty serious downward spiral. We've been declining for many years, and there's I think a major need to look at the urban canopy and the tree part of green infrastructure for the many benefits that it will bring. So the last thing I wanted to mention before closing is closely related to the why is the where, right? Because we don't have enough money to do it all, or if we don't have enough time to start everywhere, right? We need to prioritize where green infrastructure in these various forms can benefit communities. So we do a lot of work at the Trust for Public Lands with communities on planning, and it takes different forms. So in New Orleans, Climate Smart Cities engagement there, looks at, the critical, well, it actually looks at maybe 100 different factors, right? But these are some of them, right? So what are what's detailed elevation? Where's their subsidence? Where are their repeated loss claims? And where are the most people living, right? So if you take factors like that into account, where should we be prioritizing green infrastructure? In Camden, similar approach is called Green and Healthy Camden Partnership. So there we look at a whole range of resilience and climate health and equity factors to support a citywide plan for parks and green space, and then to prioritize investment that's coming from their CSO control plan, right? So these are multi-million-dollar investments that are designed to control sewer overflows, but really can be providing this amazing multiple benefits for the communities. And last, in Boston, we did a metro area tool there, Climate Smart Cities for Metro Boston. Again, brought in a whole range of data which then can be stacked up as prioritized with sort of local input and experts. Data across stormwater, heat, environmental justice factors, and others to sort of create an overall picture and to support local jurisdictions in prioritizing their green infrastructure. So I'll come back to the end, to the big list, and just emphasize all the many wonderful things about green infrastructure, and in particular, our need to do a better job and to be thinking more expansively and inclusively, and to bring all of these factors and the many benefits into our discussion of green infrastructure and our evaluation of where to do it and how best to engage communities and local leaders to support it. And with that, I'll wrap up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brendan. We are going to move right into our next speaker, but we'll have time for questions at the end of this section. So I'd like to welcome Elise Simons to turn on her camera and share her screen. We are ready for you. So Elise is coming to us from EPA New England. And you may recognize her name or her work from her work with Soak Up the Rain. So I will pass it over to you, Elise. Please turn on your camera and
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Is everyone able to see my slides and hear my voice right now?
Yep.
Okay, that's a good start. Glad to hear it. All right, thanks everyone, and hello and good morning. I'm glad we could all be here. And thanks to Brandon, I'm glad that we're able to give this introductory palate cleanser together this morning and sort of warm ourselves up before we get into sessions 2 and 3, when we're going to take a real deep dive into green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So this morning, I'm just going to share with you a few New England specific examples, some of which we've had on Soak Up the Rain webinars in the past, and just talk about what are some of the drivers and motivations for why people choose nature-based solutions. So as Rebecca mentioned, I am the coordinator of EPA New England's Soak Up the Rain program. We provide outreach and education and technical assistance to promote green infrastructure across New England. We have a bi-monthly mailing list, which you're welcome to join. If you want to email me at soakuptherain@epa.gov, I can hook you up with that. We also have a bi-monthly webinar series that features New England case studies and projects and different topics related to green infrastructure. We've actually had Brendan on a webinar before in the past to talk about the Trust for Public Lands Climate Smart Cities program in Boston. So I'm glad that he put a mention in about that. We also have a website full of resources about the benefits and the applications of green infrastructure. I do see a question already in the chat asking about permeable pavers. We do have resources about permeable pavement on the website on Soak Up the Rain, so you can check those out. And we had a webinar last year with Provincetown, Massachusetts on their permeable paving project on their commercial street. So that recording is also on the Soak Up the Rain website if you want to check that out. So when EPA first started talking about green infrastructure years ago, most of the attention was focused on what nature-based solutions can do to improve water quality and how they can serve as some effective strategies for managing stormwater effectively. This view has since expanded, as Brendan alluded to include what we often refer to as co-benefits, and I'll be covering some of these today: air quality, urban heat islands, climate resiliency, reclaiming polluted land, providing green job opportunities. It's an exhaustive list and it keeps growing. There's a lot of things that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions can do for all of us. So one of the key reasons that you might think of pursuing a nature-based solution is if you're an entity or an agency that's required to comply with a stormwater permit under the Clean Water Act. Green infrastructure projects can help municipalities comply with water quality requirements for their water bodies, such as reducing nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in order to meet your total maximum daily load requirement for any impaired water bodies you have in your watershed. So there are currently MS4 permits in New England, municipal separate storm sewer permits, that ask municipalities to identify opportunities for green infrastructure installations. In Region 1, we've generally found that green infrastructure is actually more effective than traditional stormwater management approaches, and it's more cost effective. So even when it's not explicitly required in a regulation, it's still considered to be a best practice for meeting those regulatory goals for water improvement. Over the past few years, Region 1 has been really taking the lead on different projects to study and quantify the benefits of green infrastructure for addressing water quality concerns, especially related to nutrients. I mentioned phosphorus and I mentioned nitrogen. On the right here is an impaired water body that has algal bloom resulting from nutrient pollution. So this is an ongoing problem in the region that we are working on pretty thoroughly. You can also see in this table here on the left how water quality has a strong relationship to the amount of impervious cover you have in your watershed. So the more impervious cover you have, the healthier your watershed is. When a vegetative surface is paved over, you lose a lot of benefits. The overall annual runoff volume can increase 400 or even up to 10,000%. And you're missing out on groundwater recharge and carbon sequestration and recreational spaces and urban cooling and all these other benefits. So there is a lot of reason to choose green over gray. And in Region 1, we just continue to do demonstration projects and research projects to explore those different benefits more thoroughly. So research across New England, as I said, has demonstrated benefits from green infrastructure, and we've done that at all sizes and scales. We've found that you don't just need to have one massive green infrastructure project and then leave it alone and walk away. You should really consider the watershed as an entire system. So even one small green infrastructure installation can have a huge impact. And when you start incorporating green infrastructure into your general practice for development projects and just thinking about green infrastructure every time you do an installation, the cumulative impacts of those small green infrastructure installations really build up over time to build a healthier watershed. So what's pictured here is a research project at the University of Vermont, which we featured on a Soak Up the Rain webinar this past summer, studying how different types of soil media in bioretention cells can reduce phosphorus pollution, specifically looking at drinking water treatment residuals, which are considered a waste product. But we found, or rather the University of Vermont found, that when they put these in their bioretention cells, there was some capacity to reduce nitrogen pollution. We've also featured the University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center on Soak Up the Rain webinars. And next month's Soak Up the Rain webinar is going to be with the Providence Stormwater Innovation Center in Rhode Island, looking at their work to train people in improved installation and maintenance techniques for green infrastructure. So as I mentioned, green infrastructure obviously isn't just about water. Trees and plants can also be part of brownfield cleanup programs and revitalization projects under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. So you may have heard terms like phytotechnology or phytoremediation before. This refers to the practice of extracting or removing, or in some way isolating various contaminants in the soil using trees and plants. It's not a silver bullet solution, but it can be part of the larger solution. So over the years, EPA has helped communities to clean up brownfields using grants and technical assistance and various cleanup and removal programs, and has added green infrastructure as one of the many elements that helps to isolate those contaminants and prevent them from getting into the waste stream. So pictured here with these trees, this is a RCRA cleanup project that was started in 2009, and it featured multiple elements for reducing contaminants in the soil, including volatile organic compounds. And it includes a row of poplar trees alongside the parking lot, which you see pictured here. This is 12 years in after the project was first implemented. And we featured this project on a Soak Up the Rain project this past July to talk about phytotechnology and phytoremediation opportunities for land and brownfield cleanup. Another reason you or your community might consider pursuing green infrastructure, and Brendan already talked about this in some detail, is just improving the health of your city overall. Green Streets programs is where you plant trees and bioretention cells to help filter stormwater and also improve air quality, reduces the urban heat island effect, provides shade, calms traffic, makes the neighborhood safer for pedestrians, which increases foot traffic, which is also good for your local businesses and for your local economy because you have more people hitting the street and going into shops and walking down your main streets. It also creates community gathering spaces and recreation spaces and just overall improves community livability. So these pictures are from a Green Street project in Burlington, Vermont, which we featured on a Soak Up the Rain webinar last November, about a year ago. Many green infrastructure programs that you hear about are public projects, like the Green Streets example. But there can also be incentives or motivations for community members to pursue nature-based solutions on their private property. So pictured here is one example, which we had a webinar in 2019. This is from the Rhode Island Green Infrastructure Coalition, which involved providing grants and trainings to help residents install rain gardens at 10 private residences on Aquidneck Island in Rhode Island. So people may want to be involved in projects like this because they care about the environment or because they just want to do a DIY project, or they're interested in being involved in community initiatives. Governments and organizations can also offer incentive programs, rain barrel giveaways, tree planting projects and giveaways, or other sort of financial incentives or other incentives to just drive residential interest in green infrastructure projects. Another big motivation for choosing green infrastructure is to generate green job opportunities and local economic growth. It takes special skills to install green infrastructure effectively, and these installations need to be maintained in order to remain effective. This is maybe one of the biggest fallacies of green infrastructure is implementing, installing a bioretention cell or a rain garden, and then just leaving it there and not maintaining it and not having a plan or funding to go back and maintain it. So it's really important to be investing in these infrastructure practices in the long term. So the Cobden Square Neighborhood Development Coalition is currently providing green infrastructure certification under the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. And we had them on a webinar just this past September, alongside several speakers who were involved about 5 years ago in an EPA Healthy Communities grant to install green roofs on dozens of bus shelters across Dorchester and other Boston neighborhoods. You can see these green roofs pictured here, right on top of these local bus shelters in Boston. The project was focused on green roof demonstration and on research, but even more importantly, it was focused on job training opportunities for Boston youth. Currently, the EPA Urban Workforce Development Program does offer grants for workforce development and green jobs development, which includes a focus on green infrastructure jobs. So many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with the federal focus going on with both climate resiliency and environmental justice. Recent EPA analyses have been demonstrating that the most severe harms from climate change are falling disproportionately on underserved communities who are not able to prepare for these impacts adequately. The analysis indicates that racial and ethnic minority communities are particularly vulnerable to the greatest impacts of climate change. So these two elements are quickly becoming key drivers of green infrastructure programs at the national level. Nature-based solutions intersect with these issues because green infrastructure is an effective strategy for offsetting or mitigating those impacts of climate change. Also, there is often less green space in impacted communities, and Brendan did allude to this, that the number of trees in neighborhoods is actually declining and that this is a problem. And if you look at maps showing low-income communities and overlay it with a map showing green space and tree canopy, quite often you're going to see a bit of a correlation there, and that's an ongoing problem. So if we manage it correctly, green infrastructure can actually be one of the many strategies we use to address these issues. You're going to hear way more about that relationship between green infrastructure, resiliency, and environmental justice in session 2. So I really didn't want to dive into it very deeply here. But if environmental justice and climate resiliency are major motivations for pursuing green infrastructure, I'd say that the most popular and effective of these strategies is a tree planting program. The program that you're seeing here on the screen is the Massachusetts state program Greening the Gateway City, which spearheads tree planting projects in smaller urban areas with high climate impacts and a high proportion of vulnerable and overburdened populations, including Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is the city that you see highlighted in the map here on the left. You can see that's an urban heat island map, which highlights specific locations where tree planting can have a massive impact. Trees are good for air quality, they're good for public health. According to the American Forest Tree Equity Score program, trees in the US absorb 17.4 million tons of air pollutants, preventing 670,000 cases of asthma and other respiratory illnesses per year. Trees and vegetation also lower surface and air temperatures and help with urban cooling. Shaded surfaces have been found to be as much as 20 or even 45 degrees cooler than nearby unshaded surfaces, and evapotranspiration can help reduce peak summer temperatures by up to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So planting trees and vegetation can really help improve community health and resiliency to heat, and also to rising flood impacts. Now, I didn't even provide a specific case study for this one, I'll be honest, because the issue in New England is so widespread, I couldn't pick just one. It comes up on just about every Soak Up the Rain presentation that I've ever hosted. The number and intensity of storms is increasing due to climate change. There's flooding coming from our rivers, it's coming from stormwater, it's coming from our coastal areas, and it's more prevalent and causing more damage every year. The average 100-year floodplain is expected to increase by 45% by the end of the century. The picture on the bottom left is actually from yesterday, showing how a New Jersey road was impacted by the storm that's currently going on outside all of our windows. I hope you're all being safe out there. Nature-based solutions can help mitigate flood risks and also help reduce drought risk by helping to put more water back into the groundwater system and recharge our groundwater supply. So the federal government is currently leveraging funding for flood mitigation and resiliency projects targeted towards low-income communities to help them manage and mitigate these flood-related impacts. And I'm getting toward the end here. I do want to talk about very briefly this last driver of nature-based solutions, which is the need for coastal resiliency as climate change is leading to increased sea level rise and to storm surge and to beach erosion. So we'll be going into living shorelines in much more depth in session 3. I don't want to really get into it here. I want to let our other speakers get into it in more depth. But I will mention that living shorelines, that's green spaces, that's dune grass, that's reef balls, which are the funny looking things in the bottom picture there, have proven more effective than seawalls and other traditional practices at preserving coastal health and building resilience to climate change. So these images you're seeing on the screen are from a living shorelines installations in Fenwick Borough and Stratford Point, Connecticut. And we featured speakers from these programs on 2 living shorelines presentations in Soak Up the Rain 2020. EPA is also engaged in ongoing projects to promote living shorelines across New England. So I hope we're going to have more living shorelines webinars coming up on Soak Up the Rain in the future. So I want to leave a little time for questions for Brendan and myself. We'll wrap things up now, but I do want to say there are some other EPA programs and resources I didn't go into in a lot of depth today, but for further reading, I do encourage you to check out the Southeast New England program, known as the SNEP program, which promotes nature-based solutions for watershed improvements in Rhode Island and Southern Massachusetts. There's also the Resiliency and Adaptation in New England database, the RAIN database, which provides case studies and examples of resiliency projects across New England. And you can also check out the GI Wizard on the EPA website, which has a whole bunch of EPA green infrastructure resources. And finally, I just want to make one last plug for the Soak Up the Rain website. If you're looking for information on the benefits of green infrastructure or resources on GI types or case studies or examples, we do have a growing resource library, and I'm always looking for more things to add. So if you have something you think is missing from there, feel free to reach out to me at soakuptherain@epa.gov, and I'd love to hear from you. All right, I'm going to pass things back over to Rebecca and stop sharing my slides. And I think we're going to take questions next.
That's right. And we have a number of really great questions. So thank you, Elise and Brendan. Brendan, if you want to turn your camera back on, we welcome to see you live. So I thought we might start with a question that came in that is there any research to show how large a facility needs to be to provide co-benefits? Thinking about things at the site level, resulting in relatively small facilities. So I'm sure both of you have some perspective on that. Do you want to start with Brendan? You look unmuted.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And I think that in many instances, larger facilities, right? If you've got the space and you've got the funding and the opportunity to make a large facility, you can start to ramp up the benefits, right? When you get to the point of a large, park like I showed in Atlanta, right? That's really designed to do sort of neighborhood scale benefits. But I think I might emphasize the other way around. I mean, one of the amazing things about green infrastructure is it can be so decentralized, and it can be done, to Elise's point, it can just be done in your yard, right? And then it can be done at your schoolyard and then at your park. These can be the trees that are along your street. Or new ways. I saw a comment about permeable pavers, right? New ways to build our streets and infrastructure that Elise highlighted. So I think the answer is maybe both and here, and that when you can scale it, you can do really achieve larger impacts. But there are very significant impacts of each individual small intervention.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I'd agree. And something that's great, but also sometimes confusing about green infrastructure is how flexible it is and how it can be tailored to any situation. So if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of space to put in green infrastructure, but you put in just something very small, and then you do it on the next street and the next street and the next street, and eventually you get to the point where you have green infrastructure spread throughout your watershed, and the impact there is going to be cumulatively very large. So there isn't really, I wouldn't say there's any such thing as too small a green infrastructure installation. You just got to do what's right for your specific project.
Yeah, and maybe actually I'll just add one other thing, which is I think that those sort of decentralized, so that the incentive to plant another tree in the right place, right tree, right place, the incentive to do a single rain barrel on your downspout. Those communities that have those types of programs that just get it out into the neighborhood, I think, see really broad interest and acceptance from the community, and you can really tally up the stormwater or air quality or other benefits by having multiple interventions all over.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear that it can be all scales and incentives can really make a difference. Unfortunately, we have so many great questions, but we do have to move on to our next session. I will say we'll try to get these questions answered throughout the discussion today. And then if any of the panelists see a question that they think they could answer through the typing function, feel free to do that. You can share information that way. Now that you're not speaking, you might be able to type answers while you're not talking. So you're welcome to do that. Any panelists, any speakers are welcome to type in some answers as we continue moving through the agenda today. So thank you, Elise and Brendan. That was fantastic. And we're excited to continue the learning as we go. So next up, we're moving on to our session for identifying opportunities and resources for the equitable planning and implementation of green and nature-based infrastructure. So I'd like to welcome Jeffrey King from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Engineering with Nature. So Jeff, you can turn on your camera and take it away.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, all set.
Okay. All right, and you can see my screen okay?
Unfortunately not. We're not seeing your slides just yet.
Oh, let me try this again. And how about now?
We're getting closer. We're not quite in there. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today, and I have enjoyed the talks that have been offered thus far, and very excited about being part of this this workshop. And so, my name is Jeff King, and I serve as the Deputy National Lead and Program Manager for the Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature program. And we define engineering with nature as this intentional alignment of natural and engineering processes to not only achieve the desired engineering outcome, but do it in a way that we also achieve economic, environmental, and social benefits. And we do all of this through collaboration and partnering. I have on this slide a list of the key elements associated with engineering with nature. And the Engineering with Nature initiative has really been around for more than 10 years. We actually became a Corps of Engineers program in 2020. And our program is really centered around research and development that advances practice. And this includes laboratory and field work. It also seeks to advance models and tool development, offering more insight into predicting performance of natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We work quite a bit with all of the core districts. We also work with other elements of the Department of Defense, and we also work across the United States and internationally with various sectors, including other federal agencies, academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, as well as industry. And in addition to the Engineering with Nature program, we've also developed what we call the Network for Engineering with Nature. And this is a slide that highlights a lot of what this network is engaged in and working on. The network was formed in 2020, and it was established by the University of Georgia and the Corps' Engineering with Nature program. And since that initial establishment in the fall of 2020, we've added 8 additional organizations to the network. And this group is really just a sort of a composite, if you will, of many talented individuals that are working on engineering with nature related research across the country. And the idea here is that we can leverage all of these skill sets and expertise to really accelerate how we are able to put nature-based solutions, nature-based strategies into practice. What's great about this network is not only are we advancing science and creating more of these on-the-ground projects, but we're also training the next generation of scientists and engineers, landscape architects, social scientists, and we're actually creating this opportunity to instill this knowledge and advance the practice through the education, whether it be the actual academic institutions or through continuing education opportunities that are available to the public. And that sort of leads us to one of the elements within the Network for Engineering with Nature, which is focused on equity. And I've offered this slide as part of my talk today. This is a focus of one of the research projects that's ongoing internal to the network, and a soon to be released publication that you can see listed there at the bottom. I would encourage you to visit this particular website to learn more about the work that's going on here and to really help unpack a lot of what is offered in this slide. I've also identified Dr. Kyle McKay in this slide as well. He's a really interesting individual working with the U.S. Army's Engineering Research and Development Center, who's doing a lot of work on this topic of equity, along with our partners in the network. But looking sort of at this idea of equity, I thought it would be kind of interesting to offer some perspectives on where many of the barriers are located when it comes to trying to achieve equity and looking at nature-based strategies and nature-based solutions. And then also this idea of this metaphor of a tree, if you will, and looking at the different types of equity that exist. And so, for example, with a tree, one of the first things that we see is, of course, the canopy and the leaves. And that sort of fits with this idea of distributional equity, which typically sort of focuses on the wins and losses with respect to project benefits and outcomes. But of course, if you think about it in a sense of a tree cannot grow without a trunk. And of course, with this distributional equity, it cannot be achieved without appropriate procedures that allow for inclusion of different voices and users. And then, of course, if we think about root systems that deliver nourishment for growth, recognitional equity focuses on the major issues that put procedures in place. And so, for instance, this distributional and procedural issues cannot be identified if the right groups are not recognized and included from the very beginning. So this is sort of how it connects across the three areas of equity that we're currently striving to learn more about and try to put in place so that we really do represent all individuals and create the equity that's needed to really have these kinds of projects prioritized. And that leads me to one of the products that we just released, which is the International Guidelines for Use of Natural Nature-Based Features for the Purpose of Flood Risk Management. And if you go to our website, you can actually find the guidelines. They are available to the public. We published these in September. And the document in and of itself is about 1,000 pages, and you can see the different chapters listed on the left-hand side here. It took us about 5 years to get the guidelines all developed and prepared and ultimately available to the public. We actually worked across over 70 different organizations across the world to develop this, actually in 10 different countries. And then that includes about 150 authors and contributors to all of these different chapters that you see listed here. And so if you go to our website, you can get to the guidance in its entirety. We also published a Reader's Digest version of the guidelines just to sort of make it easier for people to wrap their minds around the various chapters. And if there are chapters that are of particular interest, you can actually move from the Reader's Digest version into something that's more in-depth in the full guidelines. And then this slide just sort of depicts what you would see on the website if you do visit. We have each of the 20 chapters broken out. And so using this kind of format, it makes it a little bit easier to navigate. And so you can see some examples of the first 4 chapters listed here. And then that sort of leads us down the road to the community engagement chapter that you see on this particular slide. And again, one other aspect of what we've offered here for each of the chapters is a brief slide presentation that is offered by the co-leads. And so, for example, with the community engagement chapter, you can click on what you see in that right panel and learn firsthand about what the content is of this particular chapter from Maria Dillard at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was the lead for this particular chapter. And so just to sort of offer you, the audience, a sort of sense of how this all fits together, I've offered the key messages from this community engagement chapter you see listed here on the left. But on the right-hand side is one of the figures in the chapter. And what is interesting here is that the group that assembled the community engagement chapter, they actually used the framework phases that you see in the top on the right-hand side, the scoping, planning, decision-making, implementation, and operational phases. And what they've done is they've identified key elements of community engagement relative to each of those phases of a project. And then they've also identified the section in the chapter where this is highlighted and more details are offered. And so I think that there is a lot of value for those that are interested in learning more about an approach to pursuing community engagement, to take a look at this chapter and then go back and look at the framework to see how all the pieces sort of fit together. And then I wanted to offer an example of a project that we started in fiscal year 21 that sort of gets at this idea of equity and community engagement. And this project is focused on cold region environments. And this particular community is Point Hope, Alaska. It's located in the Arctic Circle in a very remote part of Alaska. The population is right around 700. And the population is comprised of the Inupiat Nation, and they are experiencing a lot of issues and challenges regarding climate change, and I have some of those issues listed here. What is really challenging for this community, of course, is this idea of, with the warming temperatures and sea level rise, the village itself is at extreme risk. And so our collaborative team, and I have many of those organizations identified at the bottom, we came together and we started to look more closely at what is happening in the Point Hope area. And of course, one of the first things that needs to happen is that you have to bring in the community to inform those next steps. And of course, then characterize the system. And so that's sort of where we are right now with this particular project, is to better understand the system, learn firsthand from the Inupiat Nation representatives, and then use that information to come up with some of the intervention strategies. And this project really does have a cultural focus associated with it. And what we're really wanting to do is embrace that traditional knowledge that exists within this community and be able to apply that traditional knowledge in how we go about identifying what are the right types of interventions and what are the nature-based solutions that could be leveraged here to slow that rate of erosion and perhaps protect many of their resources that are part of that village. And what I really like about this project and this opportunity to learn from these elders within the community is this Inupiat ethos of living with nature. I think that is so valuable and so incredibly important, and we can certainly look at that approach and extend it to other projects where we have minorities and needing to embrace the cultures and traditions and get that incorporated into our projects. And so with that, I'll stop and say thank you very much for the opportunity to present this and look forward to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. We have Ariel King up next. So Ariel, if you're ready to come on.
Great. I am ready. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly and we can get started. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Ariel King, and I am calling in from Washington, D.C., the traditional land of the Nakashtan or Anacostan people. I am the Environmental Justice Staff Attorney at the Environmental Law Institute, where my work is focused on building a robust and practical EJ program while working to ensure effective reflection of the principles of environmental justice and considerations across our research, publications, and education activities. Today, I'd like to take a few moments to share the importance of centering equity and environmental justice in infrastructure resilience planning and share some examples of initiatives that have worked within your region. Before I begin, I do want to briefly speak about the Institute. ELI is a nonprofit think and do tank focused on developing environmental law, policy, and governance. Our key objectives are outlined on the screen here. But I also wanted to quickly highlight the climate resilience and hazard mitigation work being done at the Institute. We are working with partners around the world to develop legal, policy, and institutional solutions to address the impacts of climate change and create more resilient communities and ecosystems through 4 main areas. 1, working with local partners across the US to develop practical, implementable recommendations for how communities can strategically and equitably move people out of harm's way and reduce the risk of structural damage and associated disaster recovery cost in disaster-prone areas. 2 is helping governments create resilient communities through risk assessments and studies. We are also helping communities become resilient by educating community members and decision makers through studies, including a step-by-step guide to integrating community input into green infrastructure projects, and finally, promoting nature-based adaptation strategies and creating resilient ecosystems. I also want to mention the BRIGHT or Blight Revitalization Initiative for Green Healthy Towns program with an accompanying guide aimed at creating community development plans for corridors of blighted, vacant, and environmentally impaired properties. You can learn more about these programs and everything else ELI provides and creates, including publications from leading environmental legal scholars, best practice guides, blogs, in-depth reports, podcast episodes, and more at our website at eli.org. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, recognizing that this often does not occur. One of the main goals of equity work in the environmental space is developing strategies for more equitable distribution of environmental burdens and benefits. So I decided to add this photo here for this presentation because it is the 30th anniversary of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and this would have been the final day of that 30th anniversary. So we are very excited to honor that legacy and the incredible contributions to the movement for environmental justice that were started in 1991 at this environmental summit. Notably, the principles of environmental justice, which were also a result of this summit, demand that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, free from any form of discrimination or bias, the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessments, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation, and affirms the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up and rebuild our cities and rural areas in balance with nature, honoring the cultural integrity of all of our communities and providing fair access for all to the full range of resources. As such, community engagement is a crucial part of decision-making to ensure equity. And a commitment to equity starts by recognizing that disparities in health incomes, inequities in living conditions, and lack of political power place many communities of color, including Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Americans, immigrants, and other people of color or BIPOC, low-income communities, people with disabilities, and other historically disadvantaged people at greater risk, and limit the capacity of their communities to adapt to climate change. Climate change is fundamentally an issue of human rights and environmental justice, and as such, and as the climate continues to threaten the stability and preservation of our planet, now more than ever, we must prioritize those who have been overlooked in environmental law and policymaking and ensure that their needs are centered in decision-making and planning moving forward in order for climate solutions to be just, equitable, and not exacerbate the harm already experienced by frontline and environmentally marginalized communities. And as we've already heard during the first part of this presentation, nature-based infrastructure projects have potential to create lots and lots of benefits. So thank you, Elise and Brendan, for pointing that out. But in order to make sure that those who have been excluded from environmental decision-making are being prioritized, community engagement must be inclusive, robust, and iterative throughout the process. As this slide reads, community engagement requires added time, building trust, and valuing community expertise. Equity requires an acknowledgement that people with more privilege are often able to respond more quickly. So taking this into account during engagement planning and developing process and project timelines is essential and crucial. And in the ELI report that I mentioned earlier, one of the on the subject, it notes that local governments need to be prepared for long-term engagement since it takes time to build trust, collect and utilize best local knowledge, and encourage buy-in from communities. Meaningful equity, inclusion, and engagement requires listening. While there are some of the benefits of community engagement include increased likelihood that projects or solutions will be widely accepted, creating more effective solutions that draw on local knowledge, empowering and integrating people from different backgrounds in the decision-making process, creating multiple opportunities for discussing concerns through ongoing discussions, and increasing trust in community organizations and governance. And so specific to green infrastructure projects, ELI recommends the following steps for community engagement. First, outreach to the community, getting initial input from the community, taking and synthesizing that community output into a draft proposal, then obtaining feedback from the community on that draft proposal, incorporating the feedback as appropriate, finalizing the proposal, distributing it back to the community, involving the community in implementation and monitoring to the extent possible, then of course, providing updates to the community throughout the entire process. The engagement process should focus on the overarching objectives of the communities and agencies involved, which should generally require a neutral approach to any specific final solution. And good engagement minimizes the risk of project failure and project schedule delays and enhances opportunities for long-term sustainable outcomes that benefit multiple parties. So now with this in mind, I just wanted to share a few quick examples happening within your region that are excellent examples of community engagement. First is the REJOICE project, and REJOICE stands for Rural Environmental Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise. Started at Vermont Law School, this program is a holistic approach to answering the question, what does EJ look like in Vermont? With the goal of developing environmental justice policies for the state. After spending time developing relationships with stakeholders and community leaders across the state, the group conducts door-to-door surveys, in-depth interviews, and community conversations across the state of Vermont. And community members who are surveyed are compensated for their time and sharing of their expertise, and of course are kept informed on updates related to the project. In addition to Vermont Law School, the project is in collaboration with the organizations that are outlined below. And the group is partnering with the State Department of Environmental Conservation to develop both a community engagement plan and language access plan for the upcoming year. You can learn more about this project and many others that Vermont is working on right now by visiting the group's website or contacting their new Environmental Justice Network Coordinator, Brittany Watson. Next is the Connecticut Governor's Council on Climate Change, or GC3. This was created through an executive order with the goal of developing a robust climate action plan for the state, engaging as many community stakeholders as possible. There's an equity and environmental justice working group whose focus is ensuring that this process is as inclusive as possible, recognizing that failing to listen to environmental justice communities raises the likelihood of missing key strategies and risks exacerbating inequalities in Connecticut. The report from phase 1 of the GC3's process was released in January of this year, and you can read it on their website, as well as other reports from subcommittees, watch meetings that have been hosted so far, and other things. And I really just wanted to point out these 2 quotes that were made available through this report that was released, focusing on the need for equitable planning and the consideration of community voices and expertise in this process. So a well-planned process for engagement for all who have been interested, have influence over or will potentially be impacted by a project to be involved from an early stage, to be kept informed, understand, and add unique perspectives and influence positive outcomes. So I wanted to thank you for your time. Thank you to the AAAS for having me. And please do not hesitate to reach out if you have further questions or are interested in partnering with the Environmental Law Institute in any of your future work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ariel. This has been really interesting to hear from you as well as from Jeff. Jeff, if you're available, you can turn your camera on and come back to us on the screen. We have had so many fantastic questions coming in through the Q&A. One that I thought maybe it came in during the first session, but might be something to address here is related to gentrification. So it's post-implementation of large-scale green infrastructure, such as parks. Have you seen gentrification occur within that neighborhood? Is potential climate or green gentrification impacts incorporated into the planning? And how would that work, or how does it work? If either of you has any perspective or experience to share with that.
Ariel, you probably have more background on that.
Sure. I mean, I don't have any particular examples to share, but I do recognize that there is potential for climate gentrification, and that's, something that's very real, and it's becoming more and more prevalent as we are seeing sea level rise. And so there's a lot of changes that are happening with ownership and land and the priorities of what land is, most valuable as people want to become closer to the inland areas as opposed to on coastlines. And so, yeah, I think that that's going to be a very, very important part of natural infrastructure work, is thinking about climate gentrification and realizing that the impacts will be, of course, most severe on the communities who have been overlooked. And so that's definitely a part of the process that we need to be continuing to think about and continuing to remember.
Thank you. I think I'm going to just take one more question that I think both of you might have some experience with. And the question is related to a lot of green infrastructure seems to be focused on the urban environment. Because of that impermeable surface, it's very different than, say, something more different than what rural communities might be facing. So can you comment on ways to help rural communities and what that means for nearshore environmental threats like lake communities, camp roads, just a little bit different than what the urban experience might be?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it does come back to equity and thinking about how we look at funding and prioritizing projects. So that's a whole lot of information to unpack, really. But the long and the short of it is, I think we really need to think about how do we, as a nation, prioritize the needs of smaller communities and get beyond some of the benefits to cost ratios that have been used in the past, which do favor large metropolitan areas where there are typically more resources and assets, because the value of those assets in a larger metropolitan area help to move the needle when it comes to that BCR ratio. So there's a lot that needs to be done, I think, in the way of policy to sort of help with the needs of those smaller communities that are underserved. And I think that in terms of research, we need to be more focused and engaged to bring those pilot scale demo projects into those communities and those areas which have different systems, different ecoregions, and those will look different, and those natural infrastructure projects will perform differently. And so there's a lot we still need to learn, I think.
Absolutely. And that's why I think programs like Rejoice are such great resources, because they are focused on rural areas. Vermont is one of the most rural states I've ever spent time in, and just recognizing that the needs are different, access levels are different. And however, the timelines need to be longer because of the limitations that exist in terms of not being able to convene people in the same ways, because just people live so far away from one another. And so engagement generally is going to have to take longer. So taking that into account is going to be important. But I do agree there needs to be a greater focus on rural environmental justice issues and ways to center and prioritize communities who are dealing with issues in the rural setting, because they are just as prevalent as in the urban setting, definitely.
Well, thank you both. I'm so excited and disappointed that we can't continue with all the great questions that have come in. But as part of my job, I do have to keep us moving to our next section, which is where we're really going to try and workshop a nature-based infrastructure project. We have a great set of perspectives from federal agencies, folks and organizations who partner with federal agencies, other NGOs, and even people from Stonington, Connecticut, the community that we're going to look at today. So I'm going to pass the role of moderator off to our very qualified and experienced Rowan Schmidt from Earth Economics. He leads Earth Economics efforts to advance policy and expand funding mechanisms for investments in green infrastructure. And he's going to be in charge of session 3. So Rowan, if you're here and ready, you can turn on your camera and unmute. And we will say thank you for coming to us all the way from New Zealand today.
Hi, can you hear me and see me okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for having us here. It's a real treat to have, I think we have 5 federal agencies represented here, as well as the local partners at Stonington. And we're going to kind of talk through a case study in real time, to some extent here, about related to the Mystic River Coastal Resilience Planning Project. We're going to begin with a presentation of the case study by Cassandra Thomas with FEMA Region 1. We'll have some remarks from Stonington Selectwoman Danielle Chesborough, apologies for pronunciation there, on the project. We'll have a quick overview of living shorelines from Mike Johnson with NOAA. We're going to have some lessons learned from on building shorelines from David Burdick at University of New Hampshire. And finally, we'll pose a couple of questions to those speakers, as well as several other federal agency representatives who'll be joining us. So we've got a lot to get through. So I guess I'll just jump straight into it and invite Cassandra Thomas to provide an overview of the case study.
Thank you, Rowan. So Sarah, if you could share. Thank you. So just a reminder, this is this project we identified as part of the FEMA COVID-19 long-term recovery structure as part of our economic recovery support function. Next slide, please. is going to be one of the projects that's part of our ultimate deliverable, which is the recovery support strategy document that we're going to deliver to the state of Connecticut, which is a set of plans that basically the state of Connecticut is committing to implement. So this is this Mystic River restoration supported out of Stonington is going to be one of these projects. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what has been happening is that we've worked with the state of Connecticut as part of their long-term recovery structure to identify a set of projects to work on as part of this long-term recovery structure and bring into kind of this workshop situation. So right now we have 380 projects across the state identified, mostly economic, but some on the housing and health systems as well. Next slide. That are in each of the 5 DEMIS regions and that are going to be looked at by each region and also the regional emergency planning teams. Next slide. Next slide. And that that were surfaced up from the regional recovery steering committees. And now we're working with the statewide recovery steering committee, which is made up of the economic development group, the Connecticut Emergency Management, FEMA, state housing, state public health, we're classifying hazard mitigation. So we're going to go through and classify these, prioritize them, look at them from an equity point of view. So we want to make sure that each of the projects is prioritized by how well they serve like an underserved community and also have a resilience impact in terms of the environment. And once these are prioritized, we're going to look at each project, but some of these will get a deeper dive than others and brought into like a workshop situation like we're doing today. And then if need be, any policy learnings that we have will be escalated up to the Recovery Support Function Leadership Group, which we call RSF flag. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of that same structure that we talked about with the state of Connecticut and how this came to us as part of FEMA long-term recovery. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my local execution partner, select person Danielle Cheeseborough. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all so much for having me. And Rowan, don't worry, you did a great job with the pronunciation. So really, I'm happy to be on here for any questions or kind of insights we want to share during the Q&A portion, which I think will be even more interesting. But just to say, yeah, we're really grateful for the partnership. For those of you who aren't familiar, Stonington is a relatively small town. We have a little over 18,000 people here. And really, like many communities, I think of our size and probably all sizes, have a pretty resource constrained staff. So I think one of the things we'll probably get into later when we look at projects such as our Living Shoreline or other of these amazing green infrastructure projects that we're talking about, I think there's a real passion and commitment from many communities. We're on the shoreline. We talk with a lot of other towns across the shoreline in Connecticut that want to take these types of projects forward, but there's just a resource constraint. There's a constraint in terms of either internal expertise or even if you have the experts, just the time to give it to it. We're often being very reactionary. I'd say at the local level, it's hard to be as proactive as you'd like to be. And I'd say we're really grateful for the partnerships that have come up more recently to help us navigate the system, because we know there's support out there and there is even funding out there. It's just hard to sometimes even get to the level where you can get the help. I'm happy to take any questions a little bit later on, but just a very high level overview. The project that we're looking at in Stonington is along the Mystic River. It's right next to the Mystic Seaport. If you haven't been there, I'd encourage you all to visit. It's a wonderful place to go. So we had submitted an application actually in partnership with the Mystic Seaport, since our property is right next to theirs, to look at kind of coastal resiliency options. The site that we're talking about in particular for the town-owned site is actually a brownfield site. And so we were fortunate enough to partner with DECD and their brownfield program in particular to first get an assessment grant, which is done. And now we've also secured a brownfield remediation grant. And so we're actually actively in the process of working towards the cleanup of that site. And as part of it, we wanted to put in a living shoreline, since the property does already currently flood. And we know in the 10, 20, 50-year timeline is how we looked at it for the living shoreline. We want to protect this new investment that we have, where we'll eventually have a community rowing center. And so, yeah, we put together a plan for a living shoreline that will include hopefully oyster castles, changing a bit of the topography, some planted salt tolerant native vegetation, kind of resloping some work, some planted lower marsh as well as higher marsh areas, some planted tidal buffer zones. And so we were, again, like I said, we were fortunate enough to have some great partners to get us to this point of kind of a preliminary design. And now hopefully we'll have more partnerships to take it forward. But I'll stop there so we have time for questions.
Okay, next I'll invite, excuse me, from my agenda here. So Mike Johnson with NOAA will share a bit more about living shorelines.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Mike Johnson with NOAA Fisheries Habitat Conservation Division. Just wanted to share some thoughts about living shorelines in relation to habitat and shoreline stabilization benefits. So next slide, please. So over the past few decades, as most of you have known, the East Coast is experiencing a higher sea level rise and flooding, even without storm-related storm surge. And over the last few decades, we've experienced average sea level rise rates of 3 to 4 millimeters per year, and the rate is increasing. It's also increasing the incidence of sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding, sometimes referred to as king tides, which has doubled over the past couple of decades. And by mid-century, these events are projected to occur up to 15 times more frequently on a national average, and in some cases 180 days per year, which is essentially becoming the new high tide. Next slide, please. The traditional methods for shoreline protection, as you all know, are hardened structures like seawalls, revetments, groins, and jetties. However, these structures can have long-term negative consequences. For example, they may be maladapted for the purposes that they were built. So for example, the levees in New Orleans actually retained floodwaters once they were overtopped during Hurricane Katrina. And hardened shorelines can also accelerate the erosion seaward and laterally of the structures. They're generally designed for historical coastal conditions and elevations and not for future conditions and elevation. And this causes the structures to be overbuilt or rebuilt at higher and larger levels at various times in the future, which cost a lot of money. And they provide few benefits beyond which they were built, unlike nature-based shorelines, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And most concrete-based structures also generate their own high CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. So this figure is a cartoon of a salt marsh, typical salt marsh that occurs in a relatively narrow tide elevation. And as it responds to higher sea levels, the marsh migrates inland to maintain its preferred elevation. But when bulkheads or seawalls are constructed to address inland flooding, tidal wetlands occurring waterward of the bulkheads will be drowned. Next slide, please. There are multiple benefits of protecting from protecting coastal wetlands. coastal wetlands and some living shorelines can actually mitigate flooding from sea level rise and storm surge. So adapting to wetlands can adapt to sea level rise through accretion and inland migration and attenuate wave energy. And they provide about $23 billion per year in storm protection alone, which is actually much greater than the cost of protecting them. Next slide, please. So in 2015, NOAA developed the Living Shorelines Policy Guidelines. And as Jeffrey King discussed earlier, our agency partnered with the Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps of Engineers and others to develop a nature-based features guideline, which was published earlier this year. Next slide. Shoreline stabilization can be thought of as a continuum from green, vegetated, or soft to gray or hardened techniques. And living shorelines can be part of a shoreline stabilization solution, either partially or fully with vegetation and soft techniques, depending upon the wave energy, environment, the erosion, and other factors. However, to be considered a living or nature-based shoreline, it must include some vegetated wetlands and or shellfish components. Next slide. There's also multiple ecosystem benefits to nature-based coastal shoreline protection, including the fact that shallow intertidal habitats serve as important nursery and spawning areas. They serve as habitat for recreational and commercial species that have a high economic value on the East Coast in the order of billions of dollars a year. They provide numerous ecosystem benefits such as nutrient cycling and biodiversity. They provide tourism and recreation, and the financial investments to protect and conserve and restore these systems are generally less than the hardened shoreline alternatives over many years. Next slide, please. Coastal wetlands also provide climate benefits through carbon sequestration, a term sometimes used as blue carbon, which refers to salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And these habitats can absorb and sequester carbon in the organic material and in the soils for hundreds to thousands of years. However, the rate of carbon sequestration from photosynthesis generally exceeds that of the carbon released through respiration, but the rate is variable. Intact, healthy wetlands absorb more carbon and at a greater rate than fragmented and impacted wetlands caused from natural and human factors. However, I'll say that blue carbon will be an important climate mitigation strategy in the next few decades in order to sequester past and future carbon emissions. Next slide. So this is a general and abbreviated list of guidelines that NOAA Fisheries, Habitat and Ecosystem Services Division follows for living shoreline projects. Most importantly, our program prefers nature-based or living shoreline projects as alternative to traditional hardened structures. We review these proposed projects through our essential fish habitat or EFH consultations. I will say that living shorelines here in New England are still relatively new, so we're still learning what techniques and materials work best under different situations. We also recommended early communication and coordination when a new project is proposed. And as part of our EFH consultation, an assessment should be developed to identify existing shoreline habitats in the project area, what habitats will be impacted, and what habitats will be created or restored. And also, what are the short-term trade-offs from impacts and the long-term benefits that are expected. Impacts to some sensitive habitats should be avoided, such as eelgrass, because they are very difficult to restore elsewhere. And I think the approach should be what is the least damaging practical alternative to achieving the project goals. And we generally recommend post-construction monitoring to ensure that the project is successful, and adaptive management and monitoring should be employed to ameliorate any of the problems. Next slide.
Mike, and also if we can wrap up after the next slide, we've got a lot to get through. Sorry.
Yeah, this is actually
you.
my last slide. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So this is just a list of some resources that will be made available and the other resources that we provide through the workshop. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, so next we will hear from David Burdick with UNH.
Thanks, Rowan. I'd like to thank Aaas and the EPI program for sponsoring this great workshop. I just had a couple points. I'm at the University of New Hampshire, where I'm the director at the Jackson Lab. And I just want to make a couple points from my history working with living shorelines. Generally, gray infrastructure is strongest on the day of construction and then weakens over time, whereas nature-based shorelines strengthen over time. And I think that's an important point that we want to hold on to. The next slide shows some other lessons learned. Both engineers and ecologists should be on the team. And so this is an important point for making it multidisciplinary. So a multidisciplinary team is going to have more successful projects. And the permitting agency staff and the regulatory groups that are going to review the project, involve them early because they'll make the project better. So make it a better project, make it a project that's going to work for more people and it's permitted more easily. So involve those folks early on. In New England, we have a really short growing season. So it's better to plant the plants closer together so that because they have less time to grow every season and they'll take longer to fill in. So that's really important. And of course, we have ice in New England. And so I've been using boulders, like in the image below. This is a berm that was removed of waste materials in an underserved community. And I worked with a school. The small city I work with did the site work, and the school did all the planting. And it really helped empower the children of this community that they are doing something that will react to sea level rise and to help us be more resilient to sea level rise. And just make sure people include maintenance and monitoring for projects and recognize that some plants and animals aren't welcome. This is a little picture of Canada geese. Canada geese are not exotic, but they are invasive and they will rip up some of your plants. So you have to make some accommodations for making sure your invasive species don't come and ruin your project. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so before we move on with some questions to the federal agency representatives, I just wanted to pose one question to the Stonington representatives, Cassandra with FEMA and Selectwoman Danielle Chesborough. So it's just I guess a simple question, but of course loaded as these questions are. I'd like to know, so Danielle, you mentioned one of the common issues that comes up with local governments of your size is the resource, the capacity to work on these projects, expertise and so forth. And you mentioned that it's helpful to bring in external partners where you can. So just curious, are there sort of, could you share one takeaway, let's say, that stands out to you? It could be that or something else that is kind of unique to nature-based projects that you've encountered. So one sort of takeaway that could be like an unexpected barrier or unexpected challenge or even an opportunity that you didn't really think about or didn't associate with your traditional built or man-made infrastructure projects before that.
Cassandra, happy for you to jump in on this as well. I'd say it kind of loops back to what we were talking about at the beginning, but I think because it's something new, it just adds this new level of challenge, that it's not something that's kind of ingrained in the way, whether it's our Department of Public Works or our one town engineer who's a staff of one has already been doing things. So it's not to say that they don't have the kind of initial knowledge or deep interest in doing this. It's not part of the normal planning and procedure. So to add on that next level of looking at, it's not the normal consultant we might outsource things to, or how do you identify the right person who's already kind of well vetted throughout the state, who's a trusted partner. So I think there's just anything new adds some levels of complication when you don't have a lot of time. It's just harder to dive into. And similarly, as we talked about with even the grant process, why it's been so great having people like Cassandra and the FEMA team to kind of, you present one challenge and they help you bring in all these different partners, because we don't have the time to necessarily go through and sort through all the different applications and opportunities that are out there. So it's been really helpful to be able to bring one, whether it's the living shoreline or other issues that we might face as a community in this similar realm, to one entity who helps us navigate the channels.
Yes, I'll just add on to our select person's comments. One thing that we're seeing, and it's not just Connecticut, but for our smaller towns, and this is especially true of our small rural towns that have had traditional infrastructure that has had a lot of deferred maintenance, they just, the capacity issues to be able to deal with these new innovations and, understand how to approach and even start these projects and scope them is a huge factor. But also, and this is on us as the Fed family, grants are complicated and we ask for a lot of data. So like understanding and this is one thing we're talking about is there a way we can almost have like a universal data collection? Like if you're collecting data for one grant, can we use it for another grant? Or if we're doing a benefit cost analysis for one grant, could we use it for another? Like just having those conversations. There's a lot of analysis and data that we ask for, and that can be kind of a burden. So one thing that my division in FEMA interagency coordination is we're trying to gather that feedback and share it and escalate it through what we call the Aaas flag, which is kind of a council of the 108 agencies together on these kind of long-term recovery resilience issues that talk about these policies of like how we can make it easier and streamlined and less burdensome for our smaller towns and our cities with small capacity. But the other issue is, and maybe USAs can speak to this a little bit, but in some of our agencies, but some of these bids favor big infrastructure projects, like big, sexy 20, 30 million, things that senators can point to and say, I brought this $50 million living shoreline project. And so this town that may really need a small project, it's harder to get attention. And so we've been trying to remedy that with kind of trying to educate about how to think regionally and approach these grants kind of in a more regional fashion, which is not always easy for municipalities who are not organized that way, or maybe their regional, their COGs or all that haven't approached these type of projects. So just trying to build a capacity in that realm and how to organize better for that type of aggregation so they can be more competitive for these bigger bids, like RAISE is a good example through the Department of Transportation, things like that.
Yeah, thanks to you both. Those are really important themes. We've certainly seen that with, as Danielle mentioned, that the time tax with some of these programs. I think I've heard estimates we work on with sub-applicants and FEMA applications and BRIC, for example, and we've heard estimates upwards of 100 to 200 staff hours to submit an application for a mitigation project. And for a small community, that's of course a huge huge commitment. And like you said, Cassandra, the bigger projects, especially with brick, the average federal cost share, the average federal project was, I think, about $17 million in the last round of brick. So it's maybe not the best program for some of the smaller green infrastructure projects like this. But we could unpack those two issues alone for me for the next couple of hours. But we'll move on to pose a question for the federal agency panelists who we have the pleasure of having on with us. So one question for the panelists here is in the context of a nature-based solution like this Living Shoreline project in Stonington or similar, especially with a small local partner with limited resources. Do you have kind of specific advice for how a local agency can best leverage your expertise, your resources, and also how your other federal agencies can work with your federal agency? So we'll begin with Mike or Adrian at NOAA to answer that question. Then we'll move on to some to the other agencies.
So I'll let Adrian address anything like funding or other resources like that their program may have available, and I'd be happy to talk about sort of the site development as well. But go ahead, Adrian, if you have anything to add to that.
Sure. Well, I would add for the NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, from our perspective, one of the biggest things we can offer is connections to your coastal peers. So we actually run or facilitate a community of practitioners here in New England, which Dave Burdick is involved with and Mike has been involved with, where we're really searching to best understand the different techniques, Living Shorelines techniques, the permitting process, the monitoring protocols. And so even when you're in the planning and design phase, I think we have a host of communities and partners that can share tips and best practices in terms of pulling those designs together, in terms of different funding resources. We are a partner in the National Coastal Resilience Fund, which does have a pot of funding set aside for planning and design of projects that are either focused on restoration or on creating new or expansion of natural infrastructure. So that would be a funding resource. Again, we also have this community of practitioners and a whole host of case studies from around the country on the Digital Coast, which can be referenced for the phase that you're in right now. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And so I think we'll hear from Anne next, with Anne Levy with EPA on her perspective and their agencies.
Okay, hi, I'm Anne Levy from EPA. I actually work with Elise in the Boston office, so I'm not going to repeat all of the things that EPA does in any kind of detail. I mean, really, the way that we're incentivizing green infrastructure is really through regulation, the MS4 program, which requires the implementation of ordinances and other things that require green infrastructure as a solution to stormwater management. We're grant makers. You can work with the 319 program. We're not going to have time to go into these, but you can contact Elise and me. So there's grants that are available, and there is technical assistance available from Region 1 for small scale green infrastructure and even larger. There's 2 points that I really want to make, though, that haven't been made today that are kind of answers the question, but I think they're both important. One is we haven't talked at all about the state role, the role of the state DEPs in supporting green infrastructure. In Massachusetts, where I do a lot of my work, there is a nature-based solution grant program. So anyone listening to this call needs to be understanding what is available in their state, because the states are closer than the federal government to the ground in providing green infrastructure. The second thing, we've talked a lot about grants going down. One of the things that EPA Region 1 is working on is trying to build capacity for financing from the ground up. So one of the pilot programs that we have, and the resources will be listed in the resource guide, is we are working closely with communities to actually help them implement local dedicated funding streams to fund stormwater management, which translates into green infrastructure BMPs, resiliency and adaptation practices. So we've been running pilots in New England. We're about to run our third in the Mystic. We ran one in Rhode Island. This is a really, really great way to work with your communities to build support for localized capacity building and funding. So I have a lot to say on this. This is a really cool effort. It's gaining a lot of traction, and I'm not going to be able to go into any more detail, but it's really about not relying on grants. It's about building capacity. I'll say one final thing before I go. There's a community in Massachusetts that started this program in 2008. They now have a reserve of $2 million in their local DPW fund for funding stormwater projects. Connecticut, you've got 0 of these things in Connecticut. Massachusetts has about 21. There's other states in the union that have hundreds. So New England has a long way to go to get these dedicated funding streams. And if anyone wants to hear more, reach out to me or Elise. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for both of those, all of those points. And as you mentioned, the state can play a very important role, whether it's providing resources, connections, or even matching funds for some of these federal programs, like we've seen, most familiar with FEMA, but that they have their standard 25% match requirement for most programs. I'm not sure, David, did you want to add a point there, a question? Okay. So next we'll move on to Elizabeth Habich from the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Habich, and I appreciate the effort. So I'm with the Federal Highway Administration. I work in the Sustainable Transportation and Resilience team. And I just wanted to point out, we have a couple things that could be helpful to all of you trying to work on projects with a DOT or related to a roadway project. We developed an implementation guide on nature-based solutions for coastal highway resilience. It was published in September of 2019. And really, I think, it summarizes the steps on how to consider nature-based solutions in the transportation project delivery process. So for a lot of you who aren't familiar with how that process works, it's the same at every DOT. And I think it helps kind of translate some of the language differences from an agency that is really meant to develop to an agency whose mission is to protect resources and do restoration. So I think, as far as an implementation guide goes, it can be really useful on both sides, both for the DOT and for nonprofits and resource agencies trying to work with a DOT. So I wanted to point that out. It's a great step-by-step sort of implementation guide on how to do the planning process, conduct site assessments, look at key engineering and ecological design considerations, permitting approaches, construction considerations, and it also goes into monitoring and maintenance afterwards. And I really liked Dave Burdick's note there about how the hard infrastructure, starts to break down right away, but the green infrastructure tends to get stronger. And so, it's really important to try to work this in along our roadways. And I hope this implementation guide can help. On our website, we have so many resources. We have a white paper that supports that implementation guide. We've done peer exchanges all around the country and summarized those into a report. We did pilot studies where we funded 5 different studies that were done across the country. And it was 4 DOTs that did them. And one of them was done by the Corps of Engineers on Great Bay Boulevard in New Jersey. So those are on our website. We have webinar recordings. We have additional nature-based solutions and projects summarized that were not part of those pilots. Another thing that we just did recently is we funded some projects with NOAA. We partnered with NOAA to go in with them on their 2021 award for the Effects of Sea Level Rise program. And 2 of those projects are looking at roadway deterioration and looking at the impacts of sea level rise and groundwater intrusion as well in those studies. So those will be going on for the next several years, starting 2021 and ending in 2025. So those could be tracked on the website for the ESLR program. One of those actually was funded to the University of New Hampshire with University of South Alabama and Rockingham Metropolitan Planning Organization. And then I did want to just mention, I heard the comment about, how difficult grants are, and we do have the RAISE program. I can understand that. It might be helpful for some of those programs. I know they're similar to the Build and Tiger grants that we've had in the past. I can totally understand how difficult that is. I used to be on the other end applying for some of these grants. So I understand that and would be very happy to work with anyone if they want to try to streamline that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And yeah, that's a great list of resources, and it'd be great to have those if you can send those to the organizers here, Sarah, and we can send those out to the participants. So, and just finally, want to hear from Sheila Warren, Jeff King with Army Corps of Engineers. Apologies, we only have about 2 minutes, but love to hear your perspective on how you can contribute here.
My name's Sheila Warren. I'm from the New England District Corps of Engineers in Concord, Massachusetts. I'm the Silver Jackets coordinator for New England District, and Jeff already described much of what challenges are from the Corps, and Christiane brought this up again, which has to do with the benefit cost ratio. Sometimes those projects that end up getting involved with the Corps are larger size because of the way that we do that. And Jeff brought up the fact maybe we should start to think about it differently. So that's one. There's a lot of technical assistance that can be available to communities that are not like the really big projects. They're much smaller. I don't have time to go into all of that. It will be listed on that resource document that you're going to send out. And anyone can reach me at New England District, or it can reach out to Jeff, because I know we're out of time. So.
Yeah, and I would just add that we work very closely with the Corps districts, the Engineering with Nature program internal to the Corps of Engineers. And so where there are opportunities to engage early, to identify what would be natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and be creative in that approach, come up with some of the designs, and then work through some of the modeling to determine its performance. That's what we like to do, and that's how we can engage with the Corps and the Corps districts, as well as the other resource agencies.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Sheila. Yeah, and as you mentioned, the Silver Jackets is a great resource, different states, interagency group that can provide support for projects, and that's worth looking into depending on the nature of your project. And the Engineering with Nature guide, the new edition of the guide just came out. It's about 1,000 pages long, but a great resource. A lot of good content on living shorelines and nature-based approaches to resilience. So thanks, Jeff. Rebecca.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank all of our panelists and the federal agencies that have participated today. We went through a lot. It was resources and so much information so fast. And we really thank you for providing your expertise and your time. We weren't able to answer all the questions. There were fantastic questions. We'll do our best to follow up and get answers to a lot of those questions. And then the last, well, a couple things. We thank all the participants for joining. We hope that you and your families are safe and that your power comes back soon, and that the next storm is not too terrible. And then also we do have a survey that we would love for you to fill out so that we can learn from you about what we can do to help address your questions around green infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure. It should pop up as the Zoom closes, and then also posted in the chat by Sarah Solomon. So you all should see that. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to us at the Epicenter. I think a number of the panelists have shared their email addresses. And we thank you and, hope you will join us. This was the first of our webinar series. We'll be doing a set throughout the US in different regions around the country. So stay tuned and join us for our next one. With that, I think we'll close out. It's 1 o'clock here on the East Coast. So take care and be safe.